The Royal Society of Edinburgh is a product of the Scottish Enlightenment. It was founded in 1783 and now has about 1,600 fellows in all areas of intelligentsia, significant life in Scotland. Arts, humanities, social sciences, engineering, government, business, finance, the arts, you name them. We have fellows there, or we certainly should have fellows there, and we certainly at times have had fellows there. It was to promote useful knowledge and learning. And if I adapt slightly what useful knowledge meant in 1783 to today, I think we should have a fair amount of both useful knowledge and learning coming out of this meeting over the next 2 days. So thanks to everybody who's come, to those who are willing to share from their experience and their background. I believe we will have a very fruitful meeting, not just in the sessions, but in the conversations between sessions, over coffee and so on. So thank you and welcome.
Hello, my name is Michael Keating from the University of Aberdeen, and along with Guy Laforêt from Laval University, I'm the co-organizer of this conference. So first of all, welcome to all of you et bienvenue spécial à nos amis et invités canadiens, canadiennes, québécois, québécoises, parce que vous pouvez choisir librement votre identité. I'd like to say a little bit about the background to this conference and what we're going to be doing over the next couple of days. This arose out of a discussion within the Royal Society of Edinburgh talking about our international partnerships and how we could renew them and build on not just formal linkages with other learned academies, but real working relationships. And we went through a number of cases. I explored a few cases and discarded them because they weren't particularly active or interesting. But we lit on the Royal Society of Canada, and being a Canadian citizen myself, I offered to run with this one and see what could happen. So I was in touch with Jeremy McNeil. Jeremy and some of his colleagues came over here. And it turned out that this was really a perfect match because the two societies are very similar in their reach, covering all the sciences, the natural sciences, the humanities, the social sciences. They have a similar kind of vocation. And of course, there are numerous historical and cultural links between Scotland and Canada. So we signed this memorandum of understanding or whatever it's called. I can't remember exactly the phrase, Alan, but there's some kind of formal agreement which should be framed on the wall out there to say that we would cooperate in the promotion of science and bilateral links of whatever sort that might prove fruitful. And again, because I'm interested in these things, I also volunteered to run with the first event in the social sciences on a topic of enormous interest to both cases, namely federalism, devolution, decentralization, the whole territorial and nationalities question. So again, I put together a list of themes and topics that seem to us relevant and organized today's session, which has a number of purposes and a number of foci. One is that this is the first meeting under this Scottish-Canadian partnership, so it was about strengthening these links and getting to know each other. The second was to continue the constitutional debate that we've been having very intensely. It's almost exactly 1 year since the Scottish independence referendum and 20 years since the Quebec independence referendum. During the Scottish election, the long referendum campaign, which went on for the best part of 2 years, if one looks at the general debate as opposed to the official campaign. And we had a number of meetings here on the theme of enlightening the constitutional debate that proved an extraordinary turnout. There are huge numbers of people engaged in this. We produced a report from that, which is available on our website. The idea being to try and take the debate into civil society. So it's not just the politicians communicating with the public and trying to inform the public's choice on the referendum. And the fact that we got so many people signed up today shows that that interest in constitutional matters has not gone away. So it's building on work that we've already been done, but this time trying to learn from the experiences of Canada, which has been doing this thing for well over 100 years, since 1867 and before, and trying to get some mutual learning, not just about the independence question, but about federalism and about how these constitutional questions impinge on important issues to do with the economy, society, welfare, and so on, because that is where the debate is heading here, and it's where the debate has been in Canada for a number of times, the continual renewal of federalism. And the third purpose is more academic. Some of you have been asking, why are there no papers? And my answer is, if you ask academics to write a paper, they'll write the paper that they want to write, whether or not it has anything to do with the topic of the conference. We all do this. Here's my paper, I happen to be. And then the editors have to make sense of it. So I said, no papers. First of all, we will have a discussion. We'll think about what the issues are. We'll take our time, and then we'll work up a number of themes. So tomorrow, after all of you have gone away, those of us who are part of the core team will be sitting down to thinking about how can we produce a publication out of this. So there will be a publication. There will be an academic publication. It takes a long time, perhaps a year. Meanwhile, Malcolm Harvey here has kindly agreed to do a summary of the proceedings. So as soon as Malcolm has got that together, that will go up on the website. So we'll be able to remind ourselves of what it was all about. Well, we have a number of panels here. In each case, we have somebody from either side of the Atlantic. The idea is not to have two parallel sessions. Here's what we do in the UK or Scotland. Here's what we do in Canada or Quebec. But try and bring them together so that we'll have a genuine comparison at the end of it. You've got the program there. I won't go over it paper by paper. We hope you can stay through to the end of our discussions. I've given people strict instructions not to talk too long because we want to bring you into the conversation as much as possible. And now I'll hand over to Guy to say a word.
Merci, Michael, and welcome, everybody. Check your watches with the clock just behind. We'll try to keep formally in line with our program, as Michael said. We'll try to keep time. Let me, in 2 or 3 minutes, give you some background and related information to the conference. First of all, we're all very pleased. Thank you, Madame Bell, for the possibility to be here with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The Canadian Royal Society, la Société Royale du Canada, is represented here by Dr. Maryse Lassonde, who is our president-elect, and she will become president of the society in late November. Our current president, Graham Bell, of course, says hello to everybody here and hopes that our partnership will be durable. We also have Jeremy McNeil, who will address you tomorrow afternoon for a short moment, and Jeremy is our foreign secretary. This session is enabled through a variety of partnerships. 2 of them I wish to mention. Eugénie Brouillet, the Dean of Law at Laval, and myself are members of a research group linked to Michael Keating's Center on Constitutional Change, and this is called the Research Group on Plurinational Societies, headed at UQAM in Montreal by Alain Gagnon. So this is a big partner for our event as well. And I should note as well that the Quebec delegation in London has also contributed to the organizing of our conference. 3 introductory notes, and immediately after I've finished, I will ask Thorlakson and Michael Keating to come forward for the first session, which will be on multi-level party systems. So 3 points. Let me read briefly from the preamble of the 19th century Canadian Constitution. This is the preamble, and it says, whereas the province of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Note, this is 1867. With a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. And that preamble, in a way, explains why, with your new partnership, we're trying to compare Canada and the United Kingdom. We have a long related constitutional experience. Our populations are also very much intertwined. There are Scots all over Canada and Quebec. There are many Canadians and Quebecers in the United Kingdom, so that's a point. Aside from the constitutional issues, we never exist outside of the greater world. We share many things. I think we share the fact that in our decent societies, people try to lead good, meaningful, happy lives. And what the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Canadian Royal Society share, unless I'm wrong, is that together they're interested into the study of the preconditions of such decent societies where people can lead those kinds of lives. And in the early 21st century, beyond constitutional intricacies, it's probably worthwhile to repeat some of these values that we both cherish. That was my first point. Madam, the president of the RSC talked about the fact that the society was founded at the time of the Scottish Enlightenment. I should add that we have a lot to learn from you and from your scholars. In a way, early in the 21st century, I would talk about a sort of new wave of a Scottish Enlightenment in the study of federalism, nationalism, pluralistic democracy, referendums, and so on. Mind you, don't get out of the room immediately to start a subscription for a new series of monuments in Newtown or a new section in the National Portrait Gallery. All of these people, some of them in the room that are part of what I wish to call the New Scottish Enlightenment, have still all kinds of good work to do in order possibly to deserve something like that. But remember the point. We have a lot of things to learn from you, and there have been great contributions from Scottish intellectuals to our debates, and we're looking forward to that. Finally, there are many voices in our scholarly community about these issues. The scholars that are here from Canada represent, in a modest way, some of these voices, but not all of them. And over the next 2 days, if you wish to hear different arguments or want to know about some of the other voices, my colleagues and myself will be very happy to make it available for you. So without further ado, thanks again for everybody who made it possible for us to meet today. And I will ask Laurie Thorlakson and Michael Keating to sit up front for the beginning of the first session, which will be on multi-level party systems. We will start with Laurie Thorlakson, who is the director of the European Union Center of Excellence, an associate professor, and Jean Monnet-Cher at the Department of Political Science, University of Alberta. They have 30 minutes each. I will flag them a sort of gentle yellow card after 25, and don't be sure of the fact that when it will be my turn to talk, I will require reciprocal rules by the chair. So Laurie, please go forward.
Her here, is it with this? I imagine, yes, okay. Okay, I figured that one out.
Okay.
Good morning. Okay. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Royal Societies of both Edinburgh and Canada for the invitation to speak to you today. My name's Laurie Thorlakson, and I will be talking about party competition and multi-level party systems in Canada. Usually I research party competition and multi-level party systems comparatively across federations, and I don't often speak just about Canada, so it's fantastic to get the chance to do this. I think that thinking about the operation of Canadian federalism offers up some interesting examples of how Canada is quite unique amongst parliamentary federations. And there may be some lessons in here for ways of thinking about the way that our party systems, party organizational structures shape the pathway of devolution or federal processes. It's also an interesting time right now to reflect on how the Canadian party system operates, because we're facing an election in a month, one where we have three parties in the race which are running fairly even in the polls, and it looks like the current governing party is losing ground to the opposition NDP and Liberal. Now, this morning I'd like to talk about party competition through the lens of three different aspects of party competition and party organization, which I think are quite important for any system operating in a multi-level context, for a federal, state, or else a devolved a system of devolution. And so these are the three lenses that I'll take you, that we'll be using this morning to look at party competition. The first is the territorial concentration of support, and so that is how territorially concentrated is the support for particular parties, or do parties find their support based in one geographic area of the federation, or is it dispersed? Number two, I'll look at how the parties in Canada organize themselves, and I think this is quite a crucial element to understanding how Canadian federalism and representation within the Canadian federalism occurs. And then number three, I'll look at how the party systems within Canada, within the provinces as well as at the federal level, can be compared, and why this matters for the way that representation occurs. So I want to start by talking about the territorial concentration of party support. I think this is a key vital statistic for any federal system. Most federal systems are organized because they have some sort of role to play in the management of territorially based conflict. And so the extent to which we find the support for a party concentrated within the units of a federation, certain units, or dispersed across the country, becomes important because it tells us something about the way that the whole party system works to manage or mediate conflict. Does the party system serve to channel that regional conflict into the parliamentary arena, perhaps then amplifying it and allowing that conflict to be worked out in the federal arena? Or in the case of a system where we find that the support for parties is quite dispersed across units, does it then diffuse conflict, requiring the parties themselves to mediate sources of territorial conflict rather than channeling that conflict into the federal arena? So the territorial concentration of party support has implications for the amount of conflict that we're potentially loading into the central legislative arena of a federation. And so it then it matters because it can tell us something about the potential stability of the federation. Now, looking at concentration of party support, I use something that's kind of like a Gini coefficient to measure the equality, the spatial equality of party support. And so it's the Index of Cumulative Regional Inequality, developed by Derek Irwin. And this score, like a Gini index, it ranges from 0, which would represent a perfect territorial diffusion of party support, to a score of 1, which would represent a situation in which all parties source their support purely in one unit of the federation. Now, when I calculate the score, the units that I'm using in Canada are the provinces. And so it's not looking below that level to the constituency level to try to determine whether a party's support is based in the north or the south. It's based on the units of the federation, the theoretical reasoning being that these are units that matter because potentially it's within these units where we can get the mobilized development of maybe regionalist movements or of territorially based opposition. So if we look at Canada, this is what we find. And so the first thing I wanted to show you and point out about the Canadian party system is that, and what I haven't shown you here is a comparison to other federations in the world like Australia or Germany or Switzerland. But what we find here is that Canada is the federation with one of the highest levels of territorial concentration in certain periods of time. And This line here represents the Bloc Québécois, which is a party that competes at the federal level in Quebec, and you might be familiar with that. And we might think that traditionally this is why the Canadian party system has a high level of territorial concentration, but that's not the only source. And in fact, if you look at this black line here, this traces a system average or a system total of territorial concentration. And you can notice that this line rises and falls, and when the BQ enters the picture in the early 90s, it's fairly high, but then it falls, yet the territorial concentration contributed by the Bloc Québécois is remaining constant. And so this fall in the territorial concentration, it's not caused by the BQ. So the BQ alone is not contributing an awful lot to the overall territorial concentration. Well, but what is? What has been contributing a lot has been what's been happening on the right of the Canadian political spectrum. And so we find that in Canada, historically, the two main parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, or in the past, the Progressive Conservatives, they have been successful electorally when they have been parties of regional integration, and they've been successful at securing a broad support base across the country. The Liberals, the red line, they're the best at this, and you can see that consistently they have the lowest degree of territorial concentration. On the right, the parties have struggled, and so the Progressive Conservatives, represented by this blue line, and then they become the Conservative Party of Canada in the 2000s. They were pretty good at this, but on the right we also have some populist right-wing politics which has had a difficult time with its territorial concentration. And so we see the Social Credit Party, which was based in the West with very high levels of territorial concentration. With the collapse of the right, in the 1990s, we have for a brief period of time the Reform and then Canadian Alliance. And then the right of the spectrum returns from the political wilderness only because they're able to rebuild this territorial base across the country. And so we see the Conservatives, this created after the Reform Canadian Alliance disappears, reemerges as the Conservative Party of Canada, and they managed to bring their territorial concentration down, and so they're building that support. If you look at seat share, what you'll notice right away is that when we look at seat share rather than vote share, then regional inequality is amplified. So we have an electoral system through its translation of votes into seats has one potentially risky element to it, and that is if we enter a period of time when, such as 1993, this is the peak right here, the peak period when the Canadian party system really started to break down along regional lines, we have an electoral system which can contribute to that tension, and so it can load a lot of regional conflict into the parliamentary sphere. Now, parties, however, the flip side of our electoral system is that parties need to win a majority, and it's very difficult for parties to secure this unless they can follow a strategy of securing their support across the country. So the Conservatives don't return to government until they build their support west of Manitoba again, and the Bloc Québécois only is able to become official opposition during that brief period of time when the right wing of the party system, or when the party system is regionally fragmented. So this graph here illustrates that difference between the territorial concentration of the party system when we measure it by votes and measure it by seats. And so it shows us the contribution that the electoral system is making to that difference in territorial concentration. There are two other aspects of party competition in Canada which are quite important for understanding competition. And the first that I'll talk about is what we call the vertical integration of parties. And this is actually one of the key party system differences that we find not only between Canada and the UK, but also between Canada and most other parliamentary federations in the world. And parties in the UK are vertically integrated, and so it's the same party organization that's competing for the Scottish Parliament as competes at Westminster. You saw Nicola Sturgeon on the stage during the last general election campaign, and she is the figurehead for the party, whatever arena is. She's leader of that party, whether the competition is for seats in the Scottish Parliament or Westminster. This is not the case in Canada. And in Canada, we find that parties have separate, mostly, with some exceptions, maintain separate organizational structures. Sometimes there is no party counterpart at the provincial level to a federal party, and we find that parties are either have weak organizational and legal linkages or none at all. Now, why does that matter? Why should the party organization matter? Well, some theorists who look at federalism and stability have argued that a vertically integrated party, this is the name they call it, is one of the key features that help ensure federal stability, that helps integrate the federation. And the argument that they give is that what's happening is that it creates a system where the party that's operating at the regional level, so for example in the Canadian provinces, if we had an integrated party, and at the federal level would then develop shared goals and a common sense of purpose, which keeps them coordinated and keeps their policies in line together, because there's an interdependence that they both have. So the party at the federal level, as the argument goes, it needs those regional parties. They are the foot soldiers. They will do the local canvassing. They will deliver the vote. The party at the regional level, at the same time, benefits from its affiliation with the federal party brand. And so that's the argument. They need each other. It mutually develops their strength and helps deliver the votes. And then the bit that's important for the stability of the federation is that in theory, it then leads to a situation where these parties have a joint vision and shared goals, and that goal includes the survival of the party on both levels. Now, the survival on the party on both levels then also requires a little bit of cooperation and some trade-offs. It may mean that the party at the regional level might have to attenuate its claims a little bit in order to not cause conflict with the party. They have to pay attention to those potential conflicts in policy goals. So, a vertically integrated party is said to be good for the stability of a federation. But Canada doesn't operate this way. In Canada, amongst our federal parties, it's only the NDP which come closest to having an integrated party structure. When you join the NDP as a member, you are joining the NDP as a member at both the provincial level as well as the federal level, except in Quebec, where there's an exception in the NDP party constitution because there is no provincial counterpart to the NDP. And so the constitution of the party allows that you may become a member of the federal NDP in Quebec as long as you're not a member of another federal party. But the NDP constitution would preclude you from joining the party, if the federal NDP, if you are a member of a provincial party of a different stripe. They don't allow that. So that is quite unusual in Canada because in other parties, the party organizations operate as separate legal entities, and it's not expected that members of the party at the provincial level also then become members of the similar party at the federal level. And in fact, if you look at the constitution of the Conservative Party of Canada, That party constitution forbids the creation of provincial Conservative Party of Canada organizations that compete for in provincial elections. So that's a deliberate strategy on the behalf of the right in order to maintain this separate identity. So I think that this is, and we can see especially in Quebec, sometimes we talk about the Bloc Québécois at the federal level and the Parti Québécois at the provincial level as being the same party or similar parties. Well, they're similar in their goals, and we do find a high degree of voters who identify with the BQ at the federal level will identify with the PQ at the provincial level, but they are separate parties created or founded decades apart. And while they may have a lot of informal cooperation and overlap in members and overlap of party elites, they're not formally linked. Another feature that we find, and this is linked to the vertical integration of parties, is the degree of party system dissimilarity or incongruence of the party systems. Now, if we were to look at Canada and look at Canada in comparison to other federations in the world, in terms of the dissimilarity of the party system, we would find that only Switzerland has a higher degree of party system dissimilarity. In Canada, if you look across the Canadian provinces and look at those party systems, you would find that the identity of the party, so the party labels of the parties that are competing, the effective number of parties in those party systems are very different. What this means is that the competition dynamics are very different from one provincial arena to another provincial arena. It means that it also means that the potential for the way that issues are mobilized and the salience of issues, the dimensions of opposition are quite different. And then if we take these two situations together, looking at the tendency for parties to have only a weak degree of vertical integration and to have a high degree of party system dissimilarity, then it leads to certain consequences. So the first consequence we find is the way that voters behave. And in Canada, what's been noted in literature on voter behavior is that Canadian voters tend to have a high degree of inconsistent party identification across levels. And so at the provincial level, identifying and then probably voting for one party, while identifying for a party of a completely different brand at the federal level. Now, this is not very surprising if we think about the high degree of party system incongruence. When your electoral choices at the provincial level are quite varied, then and you have a different set of choices at the provincial level to the federal level, it's going to encourage or facilitate the emergence and then the maintenance of these split party identifications or the separate political worlds. Party organization and the choice by parties to maintain either loose connections with their provincial counterparts or else to sever these ties completely is a decision by these parties that facilitates this, and it also is a decision which I think facilitates their own success. So if we think back to the theoretical arguments about why in a federation it's a good idea for parties to be integrated and why it keeps a federation stable, the argument is that they need each other, it helps deliver the votes, but the price of doing that is to try to balance the tensions of being responsive to the electorate at one level and to another level. I think what's happened in Canada is that balancing this tension has become too difficult, and that's too high of a price for parties to pay. And so what they choose to do instead is to allow their parties to exist separately rather than have potentially harmful internal party conflicts emerge when provincial branches of the party are pitted against the federal branch or the federal party organization. So we have parties that have chosen separation as perhaps as a bit of a safety valve for being able to respond to regional level demands. And I'm not just referring here to nationalist politics in Quebec, but we saw that there is an electoral basis for mobilized regionalist sentiment in Western Canada as well, and especially on the right. So these are regional political demands and tensions that are quite difficult for parties to accommodate in this traditional structure of integrated parties that merge the two arenas. What we sometimes worry about as scholars looking at electoral behavior in a multi-level system is whether at the end of the day representation suffers. And so do we have a federation which delivers the goods that it's supposed to at the end of the day? And that is, and there are different versions of what these goods are, which depending upon what we feel is the greatest threat to a federation. And so delivering the goods on one hand could be merely keeping the country together, keeping everything stable. But if we're not too worried that there's imminent collapse, then another electoral good that gets delivered is whether or not the political system at each level of government is responsive and enhances representation. That is one of the justifications for adopting a federal system to begin with. If we create more levels of competition and we have elections that are closer to the people, so perhaps in a region, we get greater regional responsiveness within that sphere of autonomy. And the danger is when we move away from integrated politics, where if you are a liberal voter at the provincial level, you are a liberal voter at the federal level, and you're consistent with that. If we start getting into split identifications, we worry as political scientists, what's the reason for that? Is it the best scenario would be that you are a sophisticated voter and you have assessed your own preferences at each level, and you've assessed what's on offer by the political parties that compete. And you've made a choice which maximizes your preferences at each level. The worst case scenario is that we're inconsistent because we're confused. And we're inconsistent because when we go to the polls, we take mental shortcuts and decide to blame the government at one level for the performance of a government at another level. And we use that as a mental shortcut. And so the challenge, I think, for research ahead is to try to untangle the motivations for voting and to try to figure out what it is in the way that we organize politics, in the way that parties campaign, that might clarify these choices for voters, that would facilitate the type of voting scenario that we strive for, which is the one of greatest responsiveness within each sphere. So this is my overview of the peculiarities of the Canadian party systems, and I think in particular the most interesting contribution from the Canadian case is the strategic choice that parties have made in the way that they organize. Giving up this or turning away from the idea that an integrated party will create stability and prevent the breakup of the country or prevent centrifugal forces, and instead using this split organization as a type of safety valve to allow conflict to allow the contestation of issues to be undertaken by parties without being reined in, at the provincial level, without being reined in by the federal level. And perhaps that might work for Canada as long as the territorial concentration that I began with doesn't get too high. And so if the federal parties can manage to continue acting as parties of national integration, I think that balance might continue to work for Canada. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. And we now move to Michael Keating, professor at the University of Aberdeen and director, Centre for Constitutional Change.
Okay, thanks, Guy. I did not deliberately put myself on the first panel, but first of all, Eve Hepburn, who was going to talk about this for personal reasons, had to withdraw. She wasn't able to make it today, but I hope she will be able to join the project later. And then Nicola McEwen was delayed, but I see Nicola has joined us now. So that's why we flipped the two first sessions. Laurie and I have been corresponding a little bit about this, and listening to her, it was very striking that the themes that I was thinking of are very much in line with Laurie's framework of analysis about how the parties do or do not integrate politics at two levels in differentiated states. And I'm talking about the United Kingdom in this respect, particularly about Scotland and the UK, although the argument could be extended to Wales, and there are data which would illustrate this. Northern Ireland tends, of course, to be another case, rather apart from British politics. So what I'm talking about is really Great Britain rather than the United Kingdom. Now, Laurie was talking about the way in which parties can aggregate territorial issues in various ways, take them to the centre, broker them, or you can have a federal system in which things are diffused and there are two levels. And for a long time, the United Kingdom was in the position of having differentiated territorial politics, but only one legislature, so everything had to go through the centre. Now, I'm going to start off with two quotations here, and I just love these quotations. One was by Jean Blondel in 1974. Britain, I'm not even talking about the United Kingdom, Britain is probably the most homogeneous of all industrial countries. Blondel, who's a good friend of mine, but he's a Frenchman living in Essex. And he says, this is the most homogeneous of all industrial countries. And then Samuel Feiner, who's actually a German again, non-British, in Manchester and then in Oxford. Like many of the new states today, Britain too had its nationalities problem, its language problem, its religious problem, not to speak of its constitutional problem. These are problems no more. And that oblique reference at the bottom, Keating, 1975, this is when I defended my doctoral thesis in 1975 with the proposition that these two guys are wrong. Nobody believed me. Of course, because it's counterintuitive. And now I tell my PhD students, if you come up with a counterintuitive fact that people say, we don't believe it, we don't believe it. 40 years later, when everybody accepts it, we all know that. You know? But in between, you have an interesting intellectual debate. Now, the crux of the problem there was that Feiner and Blondel were seeing what they saw as a uniform pattern of party competition across Great Britain. Therefore, this must be a homogeneous society. And my argument is that if we did have this rather even two-party pattern of competition, it could be for one of two reasons. One is that there was an underlying social homogeneity, and this was the result of the national integration process, which was the dominant paradigm in social sciences, that we were all somehow becoming even and becoming similar. Or it could be that there's a differentiated territorial society, but the parties know how to make differentiated appeals in different parts of that society and then take all these things to the center. That, for example, is how post-war Italy works. It was a highly heterogeneous society, socially, economic, and politically, but the political parties were able to broker territorial politics and take things to the center until, in the case of Italy, this partitocrazia, it broke down. And the territorial cleavage was then exposed as being a very salient one. So what I was arguing is there is territorial politics in the United Kingdom. The parties know that, and they know how to play it in a particular way. They broker territorial issues at the center. Upon which people said to me, well, of course, that couldn't be true because you're saying class politics doesn't matter. And I'm saying that does not follow at all. Just because territory is important, it doesn't mean that class or ideology are not important. They're all important, and they're mutually constitutive. They interlink with each other the whole time. So my study, which was about the Scottish members of Parliament, argued that they were, of course, primarily partisan politicians, Conservative and Labour in those days almost exclusively, but they also were territorial brokers as well, and they were very conscious of that. I had a high threshold of boredom in those days, and I measured 80,000 parliamentary committee appearances and all kinds of measures, demonstrating that the Scottish MPs, and indeed carved out a very distinctive role for themselves. And when I interviewed them, they said, yes, you have to choose between whether you're going to be a UK MP or a Scottish MP, whether you're going to be a territorial broker, of course they didn't use that word, but that's what they meant, or whether you are going to play the UK politics, and the more you played at the UK level, the less you were interested in the Scottish arena. Now this was because, of course, there was a Scottish level of politics, but there was not a Scottish legislature, so all of that had to be concentrated into the centre. It's also become apparent since then that this was just a particular moment in time. And now, we'll take the two big parties here, because those were the only parties that mattered 40 years ago. We see in the 1940s and 1950s the Conservatives doing actually slightly better in Scotland than they did in England. When I say that to people nowadays, they say, you must have got that wrong. They actually did better in Scotland than they did in England. And then they start declining into the 1960s. Now, the line at the bottom there, and of course, they've declined almost continuously since, a couple of recoveries, but it's a ratchet effect until they're down at something like 14 or 15% of the vote these days. How do we explain that when the Conservatives in England have remained highly competitive? And there are various arguments that reinforce my general thesis. One is that Scottish Conservatives were not the same party as the English Conservative Party. Literally, they weren't. They called themselves the Scottish Unionist Party. They included, well, the UK figure included Ulster Unionists. Unionists, National Liberals, Liberals and Conservatives, all kinds of things came together in various parts of Scotland to form that centre-right coalition, and the Conservative Party, as we might understand it, was just the core of this. They start declining. In 1965, they call themselves the Conservative Party. They merge with the English Party. It doesn't halt their decline. So this was a particular coalition. Now, the elements of this coalition were the right of centre vote, the middle classes, a rural deferential vote, a sectarian Protestant vote in the cities. There were all kinds of things that were distinctive to the Scottish political culture in the cities and in the rural areas, and that coalition then falls apart, disintegrates, and unlike in England, it doesn't rebuild itself in the 1970s and the 1980s, as conservatism in England does, to become dominant for the best part of 20 years, and then has rebuilt itself once again. So it's not that the Conservative Party suddenly starts diverging. It's always been somewhat different and ceases to become competitive in the Scottish arena. How do I get this to go forward? Is the technician there? Here he is. Oh, we were stuck. Okay, thank you. The Labour vote seems to hold up much better across UK and Scotland. I say UK rather than England because the Scottish figure is part of the UK figure, but it doesn't affect the total very much. And you see that Scotland, Labour in England and Scotland competes on more or less even terms until the 1980s, when the Conservative Party in England starts to do very well. The Labour Party declines, but it doesn't decline in Scotland. It holds its position in Scotland throughout those Thatcher major years. We'll come to that precipitous decline at the end, of course, which is the last year's election in a moment. And then, if you look at the competition within Scotland, once again, you see two-party competition in the 40s and 50s, balanced two-party competition right up until, in some respects, the 1980s. You see the SNP, the Scottish National Party, that has two peaks. In 1974, it does spectacularly well. It elects 11 MPs, one of whom is with us today, actually, George Reid, and then recently it does extremely well. But the two-party competition persists until the 1980s, and then you get this rather fragmented party system, Labour holding up fairly well, the Conservatives declining to the benefit of the SNP. So we're seeing then territorial politics at work within a two-party system, straining the two-party system and eventually breaking the bounds of the two-party system. Now, territorial politics in Scotland also worked through a system of territorial management, territorial brokerage. There was a degree of social homogenization across Great Britain. That might explain some of the convergence in party voting in the 40s and 50s, except for the fact that the homogenization has continued and the party behavior has started to diverge. There was territorial brokerage through administrative devolution, the Scottish office making various concessions to Scotland, through regional policy, through financial allocations, the circumstance in which Scotland gets a fairly generous financial settlement compared with English spending on equivalent services really dates from the 1950s, and this was something that came about for a whole lot of circumstantial reasons, but suited governments very well and was the centerpiece of the Labour Party's argument in particularly appealing to Scotland because Scotland was getting a pretty good deal out of the United Kingdom. And Labour consciously made these appeals. We are the party that sticks up for Scotland. And under Conservative governments, they'd shout about standing up for Scotland, but without trying to give too much countenance and encouragement to the nationalists. The Labour Party always aware of this. Play the Scottish card, but not too much, because otherwise you'll play into the hands of the nationalists. And there was a philosophy of unionism. Unionism, now this is something that Guy and I will be talking about tomorrow. Unionism. This afternoon. Sorry, this afternoon. Oh good. Yes, we did another change as well. Just as well he remembers what we want. Unionism is a peculiarly British ideology, which unlike its equivalent, say, in Spain or France, fully accepts the plurinational nature of the United Kingdom, fully accepts Scotland as a nation, Wales as a nation, fully supports distinctive Scottish institutions, but historically did not want to link that to politics or political decentralization, because it saw this as a fatal combination. That was the essence of the unionist argument. A very fine line, a very difficult balancing act. And one of my arguments is that unionists, for some reason, have forgotten how to do that. They've forgotten to play the card of Scottish recognition and diversity with a story about the union itself. And they've started to think that the union is something that sits above the constituent nationalities rather than being derivative precisely of them. It's the same thing everywhere. It's not. Unionists always recognized the union in Northern Ireland is not the same as the union in England, and it's not the same as union in Scotland. There are multiple meanings of unionism. So there was, I argued, going on within this apparent unitary state, a whole lot of territorial politics, but it was all resolved at the center. Now, what has happened to territorial politics since then, and what are the consequences of this? One is that the old territorial management strategy, which was about pork barrel politics, differentiated spending, became much more difficult once the fiscal squeeze started after the oil crisis in the 1970s. The economic underpinnings or the perceptions of the union became more difficult to sustain. Regional policy is completely there is no UK regional policy anymore. It doesn't exist. So that is no longer available. Similarly, one can see across Europe these strategies for territorial management running into problem, whether it's Italy, whether it's Spain, or elsewhere, under the effects of globalization and international integration and European integration. Maintaining that balance within a state has become extremely difficult. And in consequence, the UK parties find it increasingly difficult to make appeals absolutely everywhere. So we see the Conservative vote declining and not recovering. This is not just in Scotland. The cities of Northern England experience the same thing. The Conservatives just disappear. So it's not just a peculiarly Scottish thing. And the UK party system then starts to become territorialized. And then we get devolution, because finally the Unionist parties concede that there needs to be some kind of federal arrangement in the United Kingdom that we used to call Home Rule, and now it's called devolution, which is a compromise between the unitary state and the federal state. So we get the Scottish Parliament, we get the Welsh Assembly, we get a Northern Ireland Assembly, but that's a different dynamic. And for a moment, we get these differentiated politics. Again, picking up Laurie's theme there, people after devolution, large numbers start to vote differently at devolved elections and at UK elections. So in the first years of the Scottish Parliament, the SNP, the Nationalist Party, does much better in Scottish elections than in UK elections. Dramatically, in 2011, in 2010, in 2010, Labour wins the UK elections in Scotland comfortably. Not a single seat changes hands. A year later, the Nationalists win the devolved elections, again, comfortably, with an absolute majority. Similarly, in Wales, there are two-level politics. Now, for reasons, again, we could discuss, that era seems to be coming to an end, or at least temporarily, because now we've got a convergence between the two levels, and in Scotland, it's the devolved pattern that's now taken over the UK-wide pattern. In other words, people at the last election voted in Scotland the way they would normally vote in a devolved election. That is, they were prepared to vote for the Nationalists in a UK election. In Wales, it's the other way around. The devolved elections are starting to imitate the UK elections. So there's a convergence the other way around. I can't really explain that, but it's interesting to see the contrast there. And what happened at the last UK elections? There are multiple reasons for the SNP winning the UK elections. But there's one particular dynamic which bears upon my theme, which is that the SNP had managed to occupy precisely the space traditionally occupied by the Labour Party. That is, we are the left-of-centre social democratic party in Scotland. Now, we could argue about whether they are, but that's their position. That's where they've positioned themselves, the anti-austerity party and all the rest. Plus, we are the brokerage party, because we will go to London and bargain for Scotland. Not only that, but we aspire to play a role in UK politics. So, in a way, there's an element of continuity here. They're taking over those two roles that the Labour Party has exploited and playing that, at least in the short run, to great effect. So the SNP then are not just a party believing in Scottish independence. That is their raison d'etre, of course. But they're also fitting into the logic of party politics. Meanwhile, the Unionist parties, the Liberal Democrats are a federal party, but Labour and the Conservatives are unitary parties, the Conservatives only since 1965. And there was another reform 10 years later, which integrated them. Labour has always been a unitary party, and even after devolution, they refused to set up a separate Labour Party on kind of Canadian lines. It's no, we'll have a single party, but the Scottish Party will have autonomy to make policy on devolved matters. And that's been an extremely divisive issue, because some people have argued you can only compete by being a Scottish party, affiliated, say, with a British party. The model is the CSU in Bavaria that allies permanently with the CDU, or the Catalan socialists. Not that they're doing very well at the moment. It's maybe not such a hopeful example, but that would be the argument, versus those who say, no, this is a unitary party. So enormous strains within the Labour Party, and wherever they have a leadership election, this is debated. And similarly in the Conservative Party, when they had the last leadership election, the main issue between the two candidates was, should we dissolve the Scottish Conservative Party and found something else with a different name, and then ally with the British Conservatives, because then we'd be able to compete as a Scottish party, because there is a centre-right vote in Scotland. There's political space for such a party. It's just the offer has not been there. So the two parties have not got their minds around that. They've not been able to resolve that conundrum of how you play the two. The SNP, temporarily at least, has been able to do by saying we're playing a full part in British politics. We will take places on all the parliamentary committees, even those dealing with predominantly English matters, and we're calling on people in England to recognise that we're part of this broad centre-left coalition. Now, where is this going to go? I don't know, but clearly what has happened is that those big British parties no longer play that territorial brokerage role. There is no British party system. There are British parties, but there's not a British party system in the sense of parties competing on equal terms throughout Great Britain, and that is clearly placing enormous strains upon the Union, because they're no longer playing that integrative role. And not only that, but the Unionist parties themselves are talking themselves out of that role. Because at the last election, when the leader of the Labour Party was asked, would you be prepared to do some kind of deal with the SNP? He said, no, I would rather not become Prime Minister than make any kind of accommodation with the SNP, which then went on to win 56 of the 59 seats. And I would argue that's a very strange thing for a Unionist party to do, to say that 50% of the Scottish electorate are out of the UK brokerage game, we just don't recognise them, so go away. And it's almost inviting people to vote for independence. And the Conservative Party's reaction to the referendum result was, we want English votes for English laws now. Now, that is, Scottish MPs wouldn't be allowed to vote on English questions. I personally think there's a good argument for English votes for English laws, but the way it was set up was criticised very, very strictly, because it seemed to be saying, now let's make a separation between English affairs and Scottish affairs. Let's have an English political arena. So the parties themselves, the UK parties themselves, seem to be doing things that are very un-unionist. In some senses, the union needs to be saved from the unionists, because they're playing this very strange game of not engaging in the kind of territorial brokerage and including territorial politics, territorial parties in the UK political game, even when those territorial parties have been prepared to do so. The future, I don't know. This SNP hegemony is not going to last forever. There's a pendulum, there are swings. But what is very difficult to see is that when the SNP gets into trouble and they become unpopular, it's very difficult to see that old UK party system reconfiguring itself. I think to replace that, we'll get something very, very different.
Thanks to our two speakers. We have plenty of time. I believe there will be mics circulating for questions. And yes, they're coming. Thank you very much. So what I will ask of you is please raise your hand, and I'll try to take about 3 or 4 places and hands in various places of the room. I will ask you to stand up and pose a question directly to one or two of our speakers. And we will start with François Vaillancourt from Université de Montréal.
So I don't have to identify.
Sorry for that.
Okay, one observation, 2 questions. On your presentation, my Canadian colleague, you talk about the Social Credit Party. In all honesty, the Social Credit Party and the Crédit Social, which morphs completely in the 60s into a Quebec party. It's got nothing to do with Thompson's vision or the Scottish social credit vision at all. It's become the regional, like the Bloc Québécois. So it's really 2 lines. My question to you was, you seem to bemoan the fact, and I think Michael also does, that the national and provincial parties are not unified. And you said something like, I wrote it down quickly, it felt like if the central parties had the right to control in each province the label liberal or conservative. So the Conservative Party of Canada should be able to decide what is the Conservative Party of Manitoba. My question would be, why would you want that? Okay? To Michael, you raise a very interesting question. You're probably aware of the CAQ party in Quebec, la Coalition Avenir Québec, which derives from something else, which is a right-wing perhaps not too much sovereignist party. We're not quite sure. You can probably explain better than you, but we're not quite sure what they are, I think. So it emerged. We have a right-wing, not centralist party. And I'm just curious, can you tell me a bit more why it doesn't emerge in Scotland? You just said that quickly and then dropped the issue. And we managed to have one, and it got about 20% of the vote last time. Thank you.
Laurie?
Okay, is this on? Okay. All right. I don't think I was bemoaning the fact that the parties in Canada aren't unified. I think the point I was trying to make is that there's a striking difference between the Canadian experience and what, if we're looking at the literature on comparative federalism more broadly across the world, what that expectation is or what norms seem to be embedded in that. And so in other countries, theorists are saying federations need these vertically integrated parties, these unified parties, if they are going to contribute to the stability of the federation. We look at Canada, we find that's not the case. And I don't think that is anything to bemoan. I think actually it's been a secret of success to the way that politics is able to operate flexibly in Canada. I question whether a unified party would be able to offer the provincial level parties across the country with the type of room to maneuver that they would require. And this is not just on the nationalist dimension, but if we look at other dimensions such as, Canada is a heavily natural resource-based economy in the West, very dependent. We have a concentration of manufacturing in central Canada. That causes tensions over economic policy in the direction of that. I think, add to that layers of differences in political culture. You look at we look at survey results, and we find if we look at Saskatchewan, we find that voters are the most socially conservative amongst. It's not Alberta, it's Saskatchewan. In fact, we often think it's Alberta, but it's not. And compare that to Quebec, we find quite a striking difference. I think parties would have a very difficult time managing those tensions, and so not being unified works best for them.
Michael?
Yeah, so you're asking me to explain an artifact, which is always difficult, of course. My Edinburgh colleague, Alan Convery, I don't think he's here today, has written about this and done some very interesting work about what happened to the Scottish Conservatives. My own explanation is that parties in decline very often end up appealing to their own core vote rather than trying to appeal to the people who didn't vote for them. So there's internal logic. This has happened to the Labour Party several times in its history, and arguably it happened on Saturday as well. But it certainly happened to the Scottish Conservatives. Another thing that struck me when I was looking at this years ago is the decline of the Scottish bourgeoisie, because back in the 1940s, you had these Scottish business firms, the Scottish business class, that contributed large amounts of money to the Conservatives and provided a social base for them. With deindustrialization in Scotland, that social base disappeared. And I must have been 1974, there was the Fairgrieve report, an internal conservative report about why we're in trouble and why we have to merge with the English Conservatives. And that was highlighted. Our sources of funding have just dried up, and we need to get money from London. I think that's quite important. It's also, there's also a curious thing in Scotland, too, about, not that Scotland is a social democratic country broadly or left of centre, because the opinion polls don't sustain that. But amongst the professional classes in Scotland, there's a strong statist orientation, and we've had surveys of medical professions, of teachers, of university teachers. So we've got some evidence here showing that they're not into the privatisation, deregulation agenda, that they're into, and again, this is not necessarily particularly left or centre, it could be Christian Democratic, you could put all kinds of labels on it. There is that support for the public domain. And the Scottish Conservatives very often realise this. They're not as neoliberal as the English Conservatives. And they're not as Eurosceptic. but they haven't embraced it fully. So maybe if we had a Scottish Conservative Party, it would look more like Christian Democrat without the religious bit. In other words, it would appeal to that bit of the centre-left that is not the kind of Thatcherite thing. But that requires them really to rethink radically what they're all about and have the autonomy to do that. And they've never had the courage to do that, to cut themselves loose and say, well, we've got nothing more to lose, we might as well reconstitute ourselves as a different sort of party. And to play the Scottish card as well. They have accepted devolution, they no longer oppose it. But they could play a good Scottish card if they realise what the old Unionists used to do. They could be a very Scottish party and even use that against the SNP. But again, they haven't done that.
I'll encourage a number of questions. I will recognize you, sir, in 1 second. We have about half an hour for this question, so we're doing very well. If our speakers continue to do as well as they've done so far, before the end of the session, I'll give them 1 minute each in reverse order to summarize their thoughts on the whole issue. Sir, India.
Hi, Jim Gallagher from Glasgow University. Thank you both for very interesting talks. This is a question, first of all, for Laurie. Could you explain a little more what kind of issues are mediated or what kind of conflicts are resolved between different inside parties at the national and subnational level? Are they primarily territorial conflicts, what Michael referred to as brokerage issues for the territory, or are they economic or class or other issues? And in particular, for those of us who really struggle with this, could you explain what the difference is between the Bloc and the Parti? Right? What are these characters up to? Is this just classic squabbling inside a political party, or do they have different, not just different places, but different agendas? That would be really interesting to know. And a question for Michael, if I may, and that is that when one looks at the Canadian system and other systems, obviously one is looking at a system which is federal across the country. And if one makes an argument that the UK parties should federalise, well, just as we have a problem with federalising England in constitutional terms, what do we do about England in party terms?
Laurie, and then Michael.
When I think of the issues or conflicts that are getting resolved within the parties, and sometimes it's instructive to think of the failures as well as the successes to try to identify those. To my mind, I think the economic ones are probably of key importance. And so some notable failures of integration within these parties. If we look at the Liberals, when they introduced their national energy policy in the 1970s, which resulted in electoral disaster in the West following that, that was a failure to devise an economic policy that could bridge the interests of the resource producing regions in the West and the resource consuming regions in central Canada. And following that, the Liberals put in quite a lot of effort to try to bring Western voices into their cabinet. This is in an area where when they were facing an electoral desert after this in the West, so they brought in Liberal senators into their cabinet to try to represent a Western voice into agricultural policy, for instance. So I think that this type of regional accommodation has not always worked smoothly, but there's been a recognition by the parties that they have to try to bring those voices in order to keep conflict down to a minimum. Now, with the differences between the Bloc Québécois and the Parti Québécois, and I have many colleagues here from Quebec who can probably give many more details. The Parti Québécois formed in the 1960s as part of the early mobilization of nationalist sentiment in Quebec at the provincial level, and the Bloc Québécois emerged later in the 1990s as a reaction to the frustration and failure of constitutional settlement, and so more mobilized around the issue of trying to reach constitutional settlement for the Quebec question. at the provincial level, the Parti Québécois can differentiates itself from the Liberals, not only from the Liberal Party of Quebec at the provincial level, not only on the issue of the nationalist question, but also on a left-right dimension as well, because they're more to the left than the provincial Liberals. Interestingly, at the provincial level, the voters are able to quite clearly voters can differentiate quite clearly the provincial Liberal Party and the Parti Québécois, but to some of the smaller parties to the left, they don't really recognize the distinctions on a left-right dimension from the perspective of the voters. We do find that there's a fairly high degree amongst strong partisans. There's a fairly high degree of identification, consistent identification, at the provincial and the federal level, and so about I think it's about 85% of voters who identify with the Parti Québécois at the provincial level will also identify with the Bloc Québécois at the federal level. That's only with the strong identifiers. I don't know what happens to voters who hold weaker party identifications, but from the perspective of the voters, that's telling us that they see them in rather similar terms. Whether that translates into votes for the Bloc at the federal level, I think we have to look carefully at the salience at that point in time of the nationalist question. What happened in practice in the last election, we saw the NDP federally mopping up a lot of votes from voters who identify with a number of different parties at the provincial level in Quebec.
Michael?
Yeah, Jim's question is about the English question, to which there is no answer, of course. Like the West Lothian question, which is not a question which has an answer, it's just a conundrum. I suppose what it would look like would be the German system with a CDU, CSU, where there's only one Christian Democratic Party in Bavaria, and it does the task at both levels, and in other länder it's the other way around. That has proved difficult in Scotland, particularly in the Labour Party, because there were elections of the Scottish Labour MPs when there was a substantial caucus to be under the authority of a Labour leader that probably sits in the Scottish Parliament. I mean, there was a lot of tension between the MPs and the MSPs within the Labour Party. And this would be seen as a power shift. There's the Spanish case, which is another model where in the Basque Country, especially in Catalonia, they have autonomous parties. The autonomous parties on the left and the right have been doing spectacularly badly. So it's not saying that's the solution. They're caught in exactly the same way between the overall decline of the centre-left in Spain, the discredit of political parties, and being caught between the competing imperatives of the state-level politics and Catalan politics. They've just been completely outflanked. They've been outflanked on the Spanish level by the Ciutadans or Ciudadanos parties. They've been outflanked on the Catalan level by the various Catalan parties of the left and the right. They've been squeezed in all directions. And another thing that just occurred to me while we were speaking is it may make a big difference between whether we're talking about an old-fashioned caucus party, a parliamentary party, or a mass party. And we've seen in the case of the Labour Party this weekend, there's a big difference. And if it was just a caucus party, you could get the Scottish caucus and the English caucus doing deals in Westminster. That's manageable. But if you've got two opposed mass parties, we may get in Scotland now the Scottish Labour Party almost certainly vote against Trident at its conference. The UK Labour Party, we don't know even after the leadership election. So where you get mass parties, the extent of the conflict could be greater, and it might be just much more difficult to manage.
We have one question here and then two next in that direction. Sir?
Thank you. Akash Pan from the Institute for Government in London. Professor Keating, I mean, you talked about Obviously, we've got this moment of unparalleled SNP dominance in Scotland, and you use the phrase that perhaps the union needs to be saved from the unionists, the main unionist parties adopting what might be seen as a sort of counterproductive approach to responding.
Can you speak a bit louder?
Oh, sure, yes, I'm not sure this is working. So, yeah, the point that the unionist parties at Westminster perhaps are responding in a counterproductive way to the rise of the SNP. So I suppose in the comparative spirit of this conference, I just wondered what lessons both the panelists thought might be learnt, if any, from Canada in terms of how, of course, we had sort of nearly 20 years in which the Bloc Québécois was the dominant force in federal elections in Quebec before, at the last election, almost being wiped out, as you mentioned, mainly by the NDP, and from current polls, I think unlikely to do much better next month either. So, I mean, are there lessons in terms of how the main federalist parties responded to the rise of Quebec nationalism, or perhaps it was just something that that had its periods of dominance and decline for its own reasons?
Which one of you wants to?
I just have something
Laurie?
brief to say on that. And I'm not sure if it's a lesson for the parties or from the parties, but maybe rather something, a way to think about this. And I would say when trying to draw some parallels between the two, to pay attention to issue salience. I think that's really key, because what we've seen in the case of Canada and with also the success of the NDP in Quebec, it's telling us that we've got more than one issue or issue dimension at play here. So there's the nationalist one and there's a left-right one. And in 2011, the voters in Quebec, I think, were thinking about economic issues, and they were thinking about that left-right dimension, and that can explain that vote choice. And we look at this recent election in the UK. I noticed on Michael's graph that if it's not a very smooth line for SNP support, but we're seeing spikes, and I think that tells us something about the way in which the nationalist issue gets mobilized and then can drop down the agenda as well. And so I would expect to see dynamics like that that are reflecting changes over time in the issue dimension that's important to voters, and how that trade-off occurs.
Michael, you want to take your pick?
Yeah, I pick up Laurie's point there about territorial politics being one dimension, left-right politics is another dimension, or economic conditions another dimension. So this is happening within a context in which other kinds of politics were going on. When I arrived in Canada, which was in 1988, the government was the Mulroney government of the Conservatives, who were historically not the dominant party. The Liberals were. And it was a very curious coalition of Western Conservatives who hated Quebec and Quebec nationalists on the other hand. And it lasted for about 8 years, and then it disintegrated at both ends simultaneously. And the Conservatives were out of power for a very long time, which shows us that these coalitions have continually got to be reconstructed. We don't have stable territorial politics. I think that's going to happen here. We escaped that in the United Kingdom because Ireland, most of Ireland, went independent in 1922. If that had not happened, we'd have had territorial politics throughout the 20th century. So we were able to ignore it until the Scottish issue came on the agenda. So we're not going to go back to that stable politics in the past. Parties have got to be much more nimble, putting together different types of social and territorial coalitions if they're going to win elections.
The sir behind, and then sir in front. Thank you.
George Reid, this is a question for Laurie. If I understood you correctly, you said that only the NDP had single-party membership at both state and provincial level, apart from Quebec. How separate is the NDP in Quebec? To what extent did that assist them in the rout of the Bloc Québécois? What do the polls show for next time? And where, going back to the first question, are the catechists?
We don't have a provincial NDP organization. And so if you are an NDP member, identifier, supporter at the federal level, you need to shop for a different party at the provincial level when you're voting. And maybe, so that might be the Parti Québécois, if you, because they are more to the left than the Parti Liberal, or than the Liberal Party in Quebec. So it forces a split partisanship. And
Current polls?
sorry, the current polls. Well, the current polls at the moment, I haven't seen specifically what they're showing in Quebec, but right now it has the parties all hovering at about 31% support. One interesting thing that the polls do show is that the Conservative Party doesn't have much extra reserves to tap into in terms of available voters who might switch for them. What we're seeing with the other two parties, with the Liberals and the NDP, is that the voters are looking at these parties, and there's a much greater propensity to switch votes depending on how competitive the race is, in order to prevent the Conservatives from winning in their constituency. So we have a huge pool of undecided voters, and we've been seeing this in elections in Canada, in provincial elections lately, where voters have been waiting until the day of the election to decide who they will vote for. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, but there have been some questions raised about the ability of the NDP to build their strength any further in Ontario, and that's a key battleground because of the population density there. But if I knew the answer, if I had great insights, I could probably make a lot of money on bets. But who knows what we're going to get next month? A month is a long time.
And we're more than willing to take a beer or a cup of coffee with you before 6 in the morning or after 10 at night to envisage all the possibilities. Sir?
Thank you. I guess the whole idea of
Your name and...
My name is Dr. Kajit John Paul. I finished my PhD at the University of Edinburgh last year under Professor Stephen Tierney. I guess the idea of multi-party systems is meant to reflect a political constitutional system crafted to kind of balance the competing multinational interests, multi-ethnic, multinational. Now, I was just wondering, in the case of Canada, I found out that there are about 577 First Nations. So I was just wondering how the multi-party system reflects or interacts with the votes, with the people, with the First Nations. You seem to reflect, to focus on the Canadian, the mainstream society, and the Quebecans. So is there any statistic to show how the First Nations vote? And secondly, for Professor Michael Keating, one of the key points that features in your research is the assertion that there are many nations and few states. And the recent trend, not just in the UK, but also in other parts of continental Europe, Spain, you see the rise of nationalism and the quest for self-determination of one sort or another, including ultimately independence. Now, looking at the party systems, the multi-party system, and in view of the fact that you were able to predict about 40 years ago that the nationalist sentiment is likely to come back, are you able to project a kind of a template for political parties, a multi-party kind of template that would be capable of balancing the competing interests that are leading to the fractions, I would say, that we're seeing along nationalist and unionist dimensions in the UK? Thank you.
Thank you. Laurie?
Thank you very much for, you've drawn attention, I think, to an important oversight here. And then when we talk, especially in the literature on parties in Canada and accommodation of different communities, we talking about political parties and representation, we tend not to talk about First Nations. And partly that's because there's a separate system of self-government that for participation of First Nations. You asked another part of your question was about what we know about voting behavior amongst First Nations, and the answer to that is very little, and it's a data problem mostly. I think the very interesting element of that would be data on turnout. Our turnout data isn't fantastic from surveys that we have, because it's difficult to get accurate information. So some surveys that I've worked with have don't deliver very high quality data when we want to look at turnout issues. So I'm afraid I don't really have a good answer for you, except to say you've really, you've asked a very interesting question, and it's one that shouldn't be overlooked.
Before giving the floor to Michael, if I may, only on this one for the whole day, supplement something to your question. Unless I'm wrong, and I have some colleagues here in the room, the leader of the Assembly of First Nations, one of the major Aboriginal organizations in Canada, has recommended First Nation people to vote in the next federal election. And after having said that he himself wouldn't vote, he changed his mind and decided that he would. In the same articles, it was also said that it is believed by pollsters and specialists of voting behavior that First Nation voters can make a significant difference in at least 20 of the 338 seats in competition at the next federal election. Michael?
Yeah, that's a very big question you asked me. What we're seeing across Europe is that territory is becoming much more salient in politics, not displacing other cleavages, but refracting different social cleavages in important ways. This is because of the way the state is being transformed, decentralized. There's a European project. Politics at different territorial levels intersect in various ways, and this territorial politics takes multiple forms. Where there is an existing sense of identity, it maps onto that. In other places, it may be a city, it may be regionalism without any cultural significance, and it produces new forms of politics. There's interregional competition now for resources, for economic advantage. There's a territorialization of many welfare issues that we'll be talking about in the course of today and tomorrow. So territory intersects with politics explicitly in a way that it hasn't in the past, and European states are struggling to catch up with this by constitutional reform, to put in place political arenas to confront these new forms of politics, or to provide a democratic space and an institutional space for these new forms of politics. So we have a tendency in Scotland to think that we're the only case of this going on. It's an example of something that is much bigger, and it's producing new types of political community. And if you look at what's been happening in Scotland over the last 50 or 60 years, Scotland has always been there for a very long time, but it's much more of a political community than it was 50 or 60 years ago. One could say that about other places. So there's a new form of politics, and institutions have got to take that into account. Now, I'll just say one thing about the UK system that is relevant, and that is that we have an electoral system that assumes there is only one demos, there is a homogeneous nation, and there are only two parties. And this is so at odds with the reality that we're getting bizarre election outcomes and distorted majorities, which included distorted territorial majorities. It's not the case that everybody in England voted Conservative and everybody in Scotland voted SNP. That is exaggerated by the electoral system, but our political class doesn't seem to have been able to get its mind around the need to rethink the electoral system to take account of the fact we have a much more diverse and complex society than we had in the past.
I'll take one last question, and then I'll let Laurie and Michael complete. I'm sorry I cannot take more questions, but you will have half an hour at the break before we reconvene under the stewardship of Alan Alexander to ask additional questions to the speakers. Madam?
My name is Ann Kubricks. I'm here with my colleagues. We're from Nigeria. I'm very keen on the territorial concentration of support. All of us coincidentally attended the national conference in Nigeria last year, and I was actually in the Committee of Devolution of Power. Now, the problems I foresee for us in Nigeria, and that is why we're looking for answers, the territorial concentration of power is a very huge problem for us in the support of political parties. In our case, it's based on religion, it's based on ethnicity, it's based on resource ownership. I'm actually from the region that produces the wealth of Nigeria. Now, when we have political elections in Nigeria, they are truly based on what Laurie has explained. And for me, we want to find a solution because the last election in Nigeria has led some of us to once again begin to drive the issue of true federalism in Nigeria and also self-determination in Nigeria for some ethnic groups in Nigeria. And for some even are looking for independence. But really we would prefer to find a political solution that actually kept Nigeria together as a country, but then gave us quite a high level of political and federal autonomy so that we can actually truly practice federalism as it is. So in terms of political parties, how do we go about achieving this from perhaps similarly from what Canadians are experiencing, and even the Scottish, because we were very interested also when you had the past, what was it called, thank you very much, the referendum. We were keen on that to see how it went. So I think we're more looking for answers here than actually trying to contribute, because we really politically, I don't think that coming from the type of political experience in terms of even rigging, what we call rigging in Nigeria, we're really political, I mean, elections are not really held because the voter is not allowed to vote. Like, I couldn't vote because even though I registered, my voter's card was never delivered to me. So that was a basic human right that was taken away from just one person. But it runs into millions and millions of people. So how do we get a solution to that?
I'll let you answer. I'll let you answer in reversed order, as I said I would at the beginning. So Michael and Laurie, Michael first, you have a minute and a half to answer this question. And possibly add a final concluding remark to this first session. Michael.
I don't have an answer. All I can say is that these are impractical issues. I don't think there is a simple answer. I think there was a time when we thought, well, federalism is a system, it's an institution, it solves the problems. Now we know federalism is multiple different things, and it's got to be adapted to the context. So what works in Scotland might not work in Nigeria, might not work in Canada. But I'm really glad you're here, and I look forward to talking to you over the next couple of days, because it would be great to compare our experience with yours. I don't have any general comments.
Laurie?
Difficult questions before coffee break, but I think the experience of, or the histories of how parties have become nationalized, or how the politics of a country has become nationalized over time, tells us that one key factor is institutional design. You can create incentives that require parties to link up across the country. The tricky part comes when you have quite deep cleavages, or these a deeply divided society, because then you can, the nationalization of politics can lead to a rather insolvable problem of where the resulting winner-takes-all politics is simply too divisive, and then you need to build in consociational devices that can share or diffuse some of those powers. My faith is in institutional design. The difficulty is not only coming up with that balance of design that creates that incentive for linkage, yet also accommodation. But step 2 is the tricky part, and is that securing agreement and implementation.
So I would like you to thank Laurie Thorlakson and Michael Keating for this first session.
Clapping for you, not for myself.
So we have a break for half an hour, and we will regroup here at 11:15 under the stewardship of Alan Alexander.